Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining Dion Leadership for our monthly webinar series. Today, we are talking about the topic, creating positive relations at work. I have our founder and CEO, Steve Dion, with us today, as well as our special guest, Taylor Cox.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you everybody for attending this segment of our webinar series. I'm looking forward to exploring a specific topic with you within the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, race relations. And as Lauren mentioned, I'm joined here by Dr. Taylor Cox. Hi, Taylor.
Hello, good to be here.
Let me set the stage with the group here on the line, and then I'll do a little more formal introduction with you about you in a few minutes. So the reason we picked this topic is, with the outcry of systemic racism over the last year, social justice movements have put a lot of pressure on businesses to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And while some organizations do have programs and systems in place to slowly work on these subjects, frankly, we found a lot of our clients didn't have that. And here we are a year after George Floyd's tragic murder, and organizations are still building a plan and trying to figure out what they want to do related to this topic. So we thought this could be helpful as a subject. And if you're like me, you sign up for a lot of different media outlet webinars, and I could attend a DE&I webinar probably every day. And some of them are very programmatic focused, some are theoretical focus. So we decided to focus very particularly on the topic of race as one of the elements to work on related to somebody's DEI program. And so with that, I wanted to start with giving you a little introduction of how kind of our business fits into this and our point of view. And then I'll do an introduction of Dr. Cox, and then we'll get into the details of our presentation. So for those of you that don't know who Dion Leadership is, we're here to be motivated with the idea of employees should be able to start every day excited and end every day accomplished. We're a leadership and OD firm, and we really believe that businesses are better if those conditions are there. And so this subject really fits well within that, is to be able to have an organization not where some employees, but every employee can start every day excited and every day accomplished. It requires you to bring your authentic self to work and to show up in a way that you're contributing and others recognize that goal. So within that, our core areas are on the screen here. And, we're not a DEI firm per se only, but in the years that we do culture and OD work, we found ourselves in many instances, even before this focus this last year, in helping organizations that wanted to be great workplaces unpack issues of gender or race or ethnicity or sexual orientation, or a whole bunch of things that just stand in the way of organizations to be able to achieve the results that they wanted to achieve. So we found ourselves in both individual coaching elements, focusing in these areas, as well as with teams, and also in OD and culture areas. We have inclusion in the workplace program, and we've had this for many years where we focus on unconscious bias and work with teams in the areas of team development and helping each person understand even style differences like personality differences. So this has been really near and dear to our work and our hearts, frankly, for many years. And we're really kind of excited that organizations have this back on center stage. And these are some of the clients that we work with right now. And many of these clients are large global workforces and have been thinking about these subjects for a long time, but many of them, as you know, we're Detroit based. So many of them have a large share of employees in the Detroit and Metro Detroit, Michigan marketplace. And, Michigan and Detroit has had its own very specific challenges around racial strife. And, those challenges within our communities come into our workplaces. So I think it's really important that we talk about this subject today, and excited to do that. And the last thing I want to say is kind of a preamble here is we really do want to create a dialogue here. So I really ask you to start to think about any questions you have in this space. You can anonymously send those into Lauren or myself, and we're going to do some prepared remarks, but then we really want to answer your questions and have a dialogue back and forth with an expert in this space. So please do use the chat and put some questions in the chat box. So setting the stage a little bit here. As I mentioned, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is the other part of the space have been put really on center stage because of the conditions within our larger communities over this last year. But honestly, as we talk to our clients, leaders' commitments range from, frankly, feeling pressured to deal with this amongst economic crisis and other things, and it wasn't on the radar and they're not into it, to others being elated because it fits their personal goals and values and it gives them an opportunity to talk about it. So there's a wide array of commitment as we go into these efforts. And organizations have competing priorities. You know, there's only so many resources in an organization. So trying to figure this out, many companies are hiring diversity, equity, and inclusion officers for the first time. They're adding staff. That, you know, we've been getting tons of phone calls to do work in this space, whether it's coaching, consulting, developing programs or systems, but it's still competing with the mind share of all the other things that are happening in organizations. And to do this well, though, lasting change really requires personal involvement and process building. So organizations can build processes, but really what we're going to talk about today is what kind of personal involvement do you, if you're the DE&I leader in your organization or you're an HR or LD professional, what do you need to do for personal involvement? And how can you help your leaders that lead people create a personal involvement? And we're going to unpack a model and a whole bunch of research that Dr. Cox has spent many decades in working on to help you think about that personal level and at the process level. So with that, we are going to, as I mentioned, really focus on very specific elements of race, why it's important, but we were really intentional not to fill up our hour today with stats and figures and data to explain why this is an issue and that it does persist. And we are assuming that you chose to join this today because you understand that and you believe that and you want to do something about it. So we're just going to start there. So with that, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Taylor Cox. And I'm really proud to have Dr. Cox as a Dion affiliate consultant on our team and is our practice leader for the DE&I space. And Dr. Cox is an internationally known speaker, consultant, and writer. His career has included years both working in businesses as a subsidiary of AT&T, but 20 years as a university professor and administrator with more than 30 years of human resources and organizational consulting experience, particularly related to the topics of diversity, equity, and primarily inclusion. He's the former assistant research professor at the School of Business at Duke University and was an associate professor with tenure at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. So with that, I introduce you to Dr. Taylor Cox.
Hello, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. I'm glad to be with you today. Really happy always to talk about this topic. And so the objectives for the day were twofold. The first one was to talk about what is race and why is it relevant in the workplace. So if you could put up the content of this why is this topic important slide. Human cognition processes are influenced by social identity factors such as race. Let me give you just one example. There's a man named Henry Todgeville who's done some amazing work in this area. And just to give you an example of the power of this, he did some experiments many years ago where he simply divided people into two groups based on something very arbitrary. I think what he actually did was he had them guess how many dots were on a piece of paper or something like that. And if you did better at that, you went in one group, and if you didn't do as well, you went in a different group. And then he went through a series of exercises with them, one of which was to decide how much money you would give to other people based on which group they were in. And what he found was that even though the groups were just divided almost arbitrarily by this meaningless criterion, that the group that the person was in was favored over the other group. So immediately he created this in-group, out-group dynamic that affected people's behavior. Another famous experiment in this space, in this area, is the Jane Elliott's work with children in Iowa, where she decided to divide her class into brown-eyed people and blue-eyed people. And then she told the class, first she told them that the blue-eyed people were special and they had special abilities and so on and so forth. And then she just observed the children after that, and she found that the brown-eyed people were being discriminated against. Then she reversed it, and she had the brown-eyed people be the special people. And guess what? The discrimination then shifted to be unfavorable toward the brown-eyed people. So this is a very powerful human phenomenon. It's really a part of how humans process information and interaction with other people, and how it's a part of how they define themselves. And race is, for many reasons, one of the most important social identity factors. Now, here are some of the reasons why race is important in the workplace. So that's bullet number 3. These are just some of the ways in which race impacts what happens in the workplace. And I could talk about any of these more for those that are interested. But communications, interpersonal conflict, I have personal research on these 2 things showing how workforces separate on those 2 things and their beliefs about the effectiveness of these things or whether or not they're happening based on race. The quality of teamwork, pay equity, I have clear evidence that is race is relevant to that. Promotion and key assignment decisions. And to keep in mind that race is not always affecting any of these, but it's often affecting all of these. And that's something that every leader should be concerned about. Access to the informal organization, turnover, morale, and job satisfaction, which have then been found to be linked to productivity, creativity and problem solving, output, and then the extent to which people feel respected and treated with civility at work. So these are all factors that I've found in my 30 plus years of work to be related to race in some way. So just a little bit about why it's relevant. And our question, Steve, are you gonna?
Yeah, so we thought we'd take a quick poll, kind of pulse check of this audience first, to just ask you, how comfortable are you and your leaders? I know we're asking 2 different groups, but generally speaking, the collective group, you and your leaders in your organization, with your knowledge and ability to enact behaviors related to positive race relations. So we wanted to get a sense of, is this something that your organizations are talking about specifically related to race? Or is this something that's brand new? So our criteria or our questions are, and just again, be honest, it's not on with everybody, but where are you at with, are you very comfortable? Like we do it all the time, somewhat like we talk about race, or really people are not comfortable. Like race is taboo. It's not a subject I want to talk about. I'm scared, concerned, intimidated. Yes, just want to leave this up for a few more seconds and try to get a vote from the audience here. And we'll let you know what the group says. Okay, can you see that on the screen too, Taylor? So we have.
Yes, I can.
The 69% of the people say somewhat. We engage in healthy dialogue with others on this topic, but from time to time. 24%, which is a pretty good hunk as well, they're not comfortable with it at all. And only 7% said they're comfortable with this topic. So, how does that strike you? In terms of what you see in the world, Taylor?
I think it's pretty much what I would expect. Somewhat is a big category, and that's where I would have expected most people to land. But I think it's instructive that almost a quarter are candidly saying, gee, I'm not comfortable. Keeping in mind that this is not necessarily about the person who's on the call, but it's about their team where they work. And so the takeaway for me is that over 90% are not very comfortable, and perhaps today will be of help to them.
So hopefully by the end of today, people will feel a little bit more equipped. So shall we talk about what you can do to make a difference? And if you want to set the stage for where these 12 items came from, that would be great.
Sure. Let me say right at the outset that these 12 principles that I'm going to talk about are taken from a book, which I edited and did a lot of the writing on, but it's a project of a nonprofit called and there's the book, Creating Positive Race Relations, with a subtitle that is What You Can Do to Make a Difference. And it's a project of the Alliance for Racial Harmony, which is a nonprofit organization newly formed. And there are 11 other contributors to this publication, which was created out of meetings that we did to learn about race together, which I facilitated. And we took those learnings and put them in this book to help other people go through the same learning process that these 11 other contributors did. So that's just a quick background on where it came from. And what I want to do now is get into these 12 principles and make some comments about each. So the first one is to know your baseline, and what this is basically asking you to do. And let me say that this approach is an approach about personal development to be competent with racial diversity in the workplace or wherever you are functioning in social settings. So it's not an organization change, organization transformation workbook. It's a workbook about individuals and groups of individuals becoming more personally competent in dealing with racial issues. So we start with knowing your baseline, meaning what's your starting point? And I think the poll was helpful in this regard in terms of just comfort level in this area. But one of the things that I think will help people to get a reading on that is the first thing that you're asked to do in chapter 1 of the book, which is to initiate a conversation, not just a passing conversation, but a substantive conversation with someone else of a different race, and journal what you hear. That is one helpful thing. I just want to share a quick example. One of the contributors of the book asked one of the other contributors, this is a white contributor asking a racial minority African-American contributor, what was the most significant event in American history? And the African-American friend said it was the emancipation of slaves in the United States. And my white friend was a little taken aback because he thought to himself and realized that wasn't even on his list of the most important things in the history of the country. So it kind of alerted him that, gee, I'm not as up to speed in this area as I need to be. So that's one of the specific things that we can do. The second thing is making a conscious decision to be uncomfortable. There's some very important work that was done by a lady named Rosabeth Moss Cantor on tokenism. One of the ways or circumstances where we're just uncomfortable is being one of a few racially in a social setting. And most racial minorities go through this all the time. Many whites don't necessarily have this experience on a regular basis. So one of the ways to put yourself in discomfort is to deliberately put yourself in a place where you are in a token situation and experience that discomfort and work through it. Another example I would give is to draw attention to this issue in a group of people where that may not be a popular thing to do. It will make most people uncomfortable to bring this up, race up, in the context of another conversation or a conversation where it hasn't been part of the conversation. but we got to accept that discomfort. So to deliberately interject or initiate conversation about race in a place where it might be somewhat unwelcome is one of the ways to demonstrate that I have accepted discomfort. The third principle is to understand the personal impact of race. I would recommend to you, with the help of an associate, to analyze the causes of these racial incidents that are happening in our country constantly, where a young African-American male is having some incident with a law enforcement officer. In some of these circumstances, they're excessive force, the individual ends up dead. Analyze these incidents with a friend of a different race. And one of the reasons it's important to have friends of a different race is because these are not simple like the media wants to portray them. They're much more complicated and nuanced. And to have the perspective of a person of a different race will help you bring that out and see that it's more than meets the eye. So just as one quick example, the Breonna Taylor incident in Louisville is very different from the George Floyd situation. A lot of people don't realize that because sometimes what we see in the media makes it seem like they're the same. They're not the same. So that will help us to understand. I want to just share it because this is very important. If we could take another minute on it, that understanding the personal impact of race requires us to understand that in our country, due to a variety of circumstances, which I could talk about in detail, there is a brand of inferiority on African Americans, especially Hispanic, Latina Americans, Native Americans, and also Asian Americans. The strength of that brand varies, but there is a brand of inferiority in some way on all of those groups. And just to give you one anecdote to understand that, when I was a professor at Duke, I was teaching a course on manufacturing strategy. I had done my dissertation on manufacturing strategy, so I was well prepared. And I went into class on the first day, group of about, I'd say 50 students. On the break, about 8 of those students left the class, and one of the people who had been a friend with them came to my office that day. Remember, this is the first day of class, and told me, I am so sorry to have to tell you this, but those people left because they did not want to be taught by a Black professor. And they assumed that they were not going to get a high quality course from you because you're African American. He told me that to my face. And the things that, and I've had a couple other experiences I won't share for the sake of time, but the thing to note about this is that if you make that judgment on the first day of class, what is it based on? It's not based on any factual information, any tangible information. It's got to be based on some preconceived idea about African Americans. And that is the brand of inferiority that unfortunately is out there and that we don't choose, but it follows us around, shall we say. Let's go on. Becoming an active listener. And here are 3 hallmarks to say, what does that mean? 3 hallmarks of being an active listener. Number 1 is that we avoid interruption. We avoid interrupting people. Number 2 is that we concentrate and really pay close attention to what they're telling us. Number 3 is that we ask questions to clarify and make sure that we understand what they're telling us and get it right. And the 4th thing is that we suspend judgment about the issue until we really are sure that we understand what the person is communicating. So those are 4 keys to what it means to be an active listener, enormously important in this area. Now, we have in the book 3 examples of authority distribution. And I want to just share one which is an example from, all these are examples from a real company. But in this example, what it shows is that your opportunity to be promoted, the percentage of college degree people in professional jobs that have at least 14 years of tenure with the organization, who have reached upper management positions. So this is the percentage of college degree people who have at least 14 years with the organization, who have reached upper management. If you were a white individual in that organization, your probability of reaching upper management with those conditions is 55%. If you were a racial minority, that percentage or proportion that reached up to upper management drops to 16%. So that's just one example. I could go on with many other examples. The distribution of power being correlated to race is very pervasive in our society and enormously important. So I recommend that you get the data and maintain ongoing data about power dynamics, and then dig into the causes and possible solutions to change those power dynamics related to race. The sixth principle is to invest in personal education, and the book that we've been talking about, to me, is an excellent tool to do that. It's not the only one, of course. It's not the only thing that people need to do. I recommend that people have a plan to get educated on an ongoing basis in this space. I do want to add something here, because in our time, there is a backlash in some quarters against personal education around race. And if you have been following in the media, you may have heard discussion about critical race theory or about the New York 1619 project. And the pushback, it really takes the form of, we don't want certain kinds of education about race. And one of the flashpoints seems to be education that talks about race as being systemic, as opposed to just a personal problem. And I personally think it is very unfortunate and dangerous that certain parts of our society are trying to shut down education about systemic bias, because there is such a thing as systemic bias, and we need to know about it, and we need to deal with it. But that pushback is there. So one of the things that leaders need to be doing right now is preparing themselves to respond to that backlash. Know your history. This is important for multiple reasons. One is it creates context for what we're experiencing today. And there's carryover from history to what we're experiencing today. A lot of people think of the legal rights for racial minorities, that using race to make decisions, like in the employment space, is illegal. But that's been here for a very long time. It really hasn't. We didn't have at the federal level even a legal protection against using race as a decision maker against people in the workplace until the mid-60s. I was a high school student when that happened. So it's not only happened in my lifetime, it's happened when I was approaching adulthood. So it's very recent. It gives us context to understand today. It helps us to have empathy, not sympathy, but empathy for people who are experiencing bias. And it helps us to avoid making the same mistakes, which is a very prevalent thing to happen. We don't know your history. We're prone to repeat the same mistakes. Let's go on to number 8. So number 8 is to get the facts on current events. The example that's used in the book is about the statues of Confederate military leaders from the Civil War. And it points out that although many people think that those statues were erected right after the Civil War to honor people at that time, the reality is that many of them were erected in response to pushes for civil rights that happened many, many years later. And so to understand what they represent in the context, you need to know the facts about how they came about. And so that's just the example that's used in the book. The principle is to get the facts about current events and not rely on media. I will want to add one thing here, which is social media has become a big player relative to this topic. And here are some things that I think we should avoid with social media. Number one is not to use social media as a source of getting facts about racial issues or anything else that's important. Secondly, to not post or repost inflammatory material related to this. And third is to not engage in electronic argument back and forth about this, but to really sit down with people, especially people that you know and trust or are trying to get to know and trust, and have conversation. So social media is something to really pay attention to, not use it to know the facts about current events, but really do your research. Number 9 is to make race discussable. And you may have heard the phrase, they played the race card. They played the race card. That I always bristle when I hear that said. And I think what a lot of people mean when they say that is that race was brought up inappropriately, or race was used as an excuse for something that was caused by something totally different. But sometimes it's just, we don't want to hear about race. So it's just really saying that the person brought race up in the context of a conversation. And I think that we've got to resist that kind of activity. And I would say this about that phrase. I think the race card is played for everybody the day they're born in this country. And it's not a matter of choice. It's not even a matter of how much one identifies with their race. But there are lots of people who will respond to us in part and often unconsciously based on our race. So the race card playing thing, we need to understand that that's not something that we need to do. It's already done. But in this context, we need to say it's okay to talk about race. I want to give one quick specific example for the workplace. If you have a racially diverse employee population, make it okay to talk about race, maybe even bring it up when you're doing performance review meetings. Because sometimes it's difficult for racial minority members to bring it up. But it needs to be at least open for dialogue. So that's one specific place where I would say, be sure that race is discussed. And it's as simple as saying, I know that you're an African-American or a Latino or whatever in this space, and there aren't a lot of you, especially at your level or in your particular profession or for a job function. Is that causing you any issues? Do you see anything there that I need to know about? And they may say, no, I don't, everything's fine, but at least you gave an invitation for that to be talked about. Number 10, this is hard for most of us to do, actively advocate for positive race relations, to challenge people when they are acting in a way that's going to harm your racial diversity and racial relations goals, inclusion goals, and even in social settings to do that. So take a risk, be a courageous person, take on, because they're one of the reasons that people are afraid to do this is because they think it may harm a personal relationship, which it may in some cases, but we have to take that on. So let's go on to number 11, capitalize on shared identities. This means while race is an important social identity, and it sometimes causes trouble for us in intergroup relations, there are other identities that we can sometimes latch onto that are common for us that may allow us to get past race. And in the workplace, the obvious one is the organization. We are of different races, but we're in the same organization. I'm in working with a company now, and they have the name of the company is Weldeloy, and they've launched an initiative called One Weldeloy, and the idea behind it is to promote and part of it is due to some feedback that we got that race and some other social identity factors was a divider for some people. But their campaign now is to help people to recognize different races, different work functions, different age groups, different genders, but we're all part of one team. So trying to capitalize on the fact that we are part of the same organization. When I was at Michigan Bell years ago, a subsidiary of AT&T, and this was in the days when there was more open racial tension in the workplace than there is now. We see more open racial tension on the streets, but probably less in the workplace than we did in the 70s. But I, recognizing that the races in my own department were not coming together the way they could, organized a softball team. And what it did was and I reached out and got African Americans even from other departments because I wanted a nice racial mix, and we didn't have enough African Americans in my department to make that happen. So I reached out to other departments, put together a softball team, which was almost 50-50, white and non-white. And that created an identity for us. We're team members on the softball team. And it did make a change in race relations in that company, at least in our part of that company. So capitalize on those shared identities. And then finally, and probably most importantly, to build and maintain authentic interracial relationships. And if you take a poll of people and they're honest about their friendship circle, many people they have very few or no real friends who are of a different race. And that's a problem, but it's a solvable problem. And so really building, and I want to mention two specifics here. In our book, we ask people to form accountability partners. That means you're working through the book and you want someone to hold you accountable for that fact and for what you're doing with the book. And that partner could be a person of a different race, and that could be a path to build relationship with that person more closely. Another thing that I would suggest in the work context is to think about forming mentoring relationships with a person of a different race. Whether you're the mentee or the protege, or whether you're the person providing the mentoring support, if being in a role where your counterpart is of a different race is a way to help build those interracial relationships in the work context. So I mentioned that be willing to commit the time, because relationship maintenance takes time, but it's worth it in the long run for you and your organization. So those are the 12 principles, and I highly and strongly recommend them for building confidence in this area. I'm going to pause here and see if we have any questions in the chat box you want to deal with, or Steve may have some questions.
Yes, Taylor, thank you. And that's a great overview. I was going to take the slides off and we were going to chat for a few minutes. I'm going to lead this up because there's some chat discussions. People want to comment on these. By the way, for those of you that don't know, we will send out a recording of this as well, so you can take a screenshot of these 12 items if you'd like. What I'd like to do is spend 10 or so, 15 minutes with a couple follow-up questions, and then we're going to put up a slide or two on how do you apply these in your organization. So these are things that you could do as an individual in your community, but we're going to talk specifically with a few strategies about how an organization creates a program like this. But I just want to answer a couple questions, and feel free to add more things to the chat if you would like as well, either as a group or individually. But some of the questions I guess I have right now, first is, can you talk a little bit about how approaching the topic of race is different from other sort of diversity categories that we want to work through and understand in the workplace, like gender, age, ethnicity, sexual orientation, other factors? How is it similar and how is it different?
Well, I think the big similarity for me is that a lot of dynamics around race are majority minority group type dynamics or in-group out-group type dynamics, and that a lot of the phenomena that surround in-group out-group dynamics, majority minority dynamics, carry over from identity to identity. So you see some similarities there. One of the differences is that I think race is, and I've been at this a long time, I think that race is the hardest one to deal with in an effective way consistently. I think it has the most impact overall, and people are not as willing to take it on. I find over and over again that getting people engaged around gender diversity, for example, is a lot easier than getting them engaged around racial diversity.
Yeah, I would say within our client groups, many organizations have had a gender focused diversity effort as their first place to focus. They feel that's safer, more comfortable, more doable, more mainstream, whatever there is. But I think it's a curious question as to why that is over race. You know, I also wanted to bring up, I'd really love that, just kind of accentuate this point, the overarching idea of in groups and out groups in organizations as a safe way to have a conversation. You know, race can create in groups, out groups, but, you know, as we work with organizations and unpack issues, you know, in group, out group might be manufacturing and engineering. It might be, you know, the plant that's in this state versus that state. You know, who's got the power? Who has the influence? Who do we determine blue eyes or brown eyes, good or bad today? And there's a lot of this in-group, out-group dynamics that impact productivity in an organization. So to be able to even have that conversation, you know, sometimes we'll do work around personality assessment. So the in-group is the D in DISC language, high driver people, but the I's are, if they're too interpersonal, are part of the out group, or the other way around, you know, happens in organizations. If you're too, you know, too data oriented, you're shunned. So this dynamic of layers and layers of in groups and out groups, I think is really a great, safe way to start having those conversations leading into race as one of those groups.
Yeah, and not only is it one of those groups, but again, I think it's important to get back to your question and say that I think race is the hardest one for people to take on, the one they're most reluctant to take on, to stay with, the one they're most uncomfortable about. I do think there's some special things about that particular in-group, out-group interface. And a lot of it is, you know, contextual. It's not all what's going on inside the organization.
Another question I have here is, you know, lately, because of the coronavirus and some of the, frankly, the president's comments on the Kung flu and all of these things around Asian discrimination is on the rise, basically. There's a lot out there related to that and hate crimes for the Asian population. Do you have any insights on how that, has so, quickly mushroomed? It's not quick. I mean, I know there's been issues for a long, long time, but how that's just plummeted to the top of this issue, and how might that be different than the African American social justice movement issues?
Well, there are parallels, actually. There's a long history of bias against Asians in the United States. A lot of people are unfamiliar with this, but in the legal structure of the country for years, there was an act called the Chinese Exclusion Act that was specifically directed to Chinese people and had all kinds of restrictions. And it was codified in the law specifically against that ethnic group. If you look at the history of film and media portrayal of Asians or African Americans or Native Americans or Mexican Americans, you see a commonality of portrayed in a limited and often very negative light. So there are some, so when you have this context of history and then some contemporary factor sort of throws a match on it, things ignite. And I do think that two things in the contemporary landscape threw the match on the Asian factor. One is the comments about the Asian flu, and that it was the Chinese that brought this on the world. And, they probably did make some mistakes over there. I'm not getting into that, but I think how it was labeled was a factor because it was done by the leader of the country. But I think also there's a lot of tension around immigration right now. And some of that immigration is Asian. I think there's more tension around immigration coming from the South, but that is a part of the immigration equation as well. And some people are concerned, is probably the wrong word, are reacting to the fact that Asians are doing very well in a lot of cases in terms of jobs. And some feel that that's encroaching on their opportunities, and there's a backlash coming from that. So, but the history is very important because you're not talking about this just flared up out of nowhere. There's a long history with that.
To that point, there's actually a couple of questions that came in related to your history bullet point number 7. And let me kind of smush these together to one question, I guess, for you. That do you feel that knowing history or talking about history might germinate more strife or anger? And should we just focus on common ground today, building momentum forward? So how do you reconcile that notion?
That's a really good question. And I want to be careful how I respond to it, because I've already said I think the history is important. And I think that it's important for all of us to know that history. And by the way, just being a racial minority does not really guarantee that you know the history. We all need to really, I've been studying this for years and I still don't know it all. I mean, decades. But I do think that it is important not to get stuck with talking about slavery or Jim Crow laws or the Chinese Exclusion Act or what happened to Native Americans in the mid 1800s to late 1800s. I think it is important to set that as context and then move on and talk about the contemporary issues, of which there are many important ones. I do think it is a mistake to overemphasize or over-focus on the history. And I, for one, do not do that. When I do workshops with folks, I rarely do a history lesson, but I recommend that people spend time learning the history. So that's how I would respond to that.
Okay. And another question more in today's world. So, leaders are taught to avoid practices that could open up the organization for a lawsuit of discrimination or harassment practices. What do you say to a leader who says, I shouldn't talk about race because I'm concerned about that conversation being misunderstood or misconstrued?
Certainly, there's always a risk of misconstruing a conversation. I was doing a session just a few days ago, Zoom session, and I made the statement that I was talking about ethnocentrism as a term that needs to be understood in this space. And I said one of the negative examples of that, in my opinion, is where you have an organization has, let's say, a space for people to come and do lunch, and you go into that space and all the racial minorities are sitting together in one place, and all the whites are sitting together in a different place, and there's segregation at the lunchroom. I think that, and one of the reasons that happens is people just joining together with others of like race for various reasons. But that's a negative because it goes against the goal of integrating and building relationships across racial lines. One of the people in the group, as we went to the Q&A, said, "Why did you give segregation at the lunchroom as a positive example of ethnocentrism?" Well, see, obviously he misunderstood what I said, because I gave it not as a positive example, but as a negative example. I mean, communications is so important and so easy to get wrong. And so when we wade into this area, there is a risk of something being misheard, misconstrued, taken wrong, and it causing a problem. But here's the point I would make. I think you put yourself at more risk by not doing it. And the reality is that when people are treated differently and they think that it's because of their race, you can be open to legal challenge for that, especially if the person has been separated or demoted or something of that sort, or denied a promotion. So I think you're at more risk by not doing it than doing it.
Yeah, I have a great example of that right now with the client I know that has come to us, and HR has done an investigation, if you will, with a high level employee who has said, I feel like I'm treated differently. And they are in a racial minority group, and they have no evidence to know that it is because of that, but they also have no evidence to think it's anything other than that. So the point being for them is, without anything else to know, that's the conclusion I come up with. If they were having conversations, then it was a safe place to be able to say, what does that mean and look like with this, and be able to have that dialogue. That person might come to a different conclusion. Our solution to that is going to be doing some implicit bias training, work with the team, and create a bridge so they can have healthy conversations going forward. But without those conversations, people will assume and fill it in with something that might not be true.
And let me just add, Stephen, that this is also why it's so important for organizations to track data, because you want to know that, particularly if we're talking about a pay issue or promotion issue or a suspension or firing issue, you want to know that factually you're in a good place. And what the reality is, unless you do regular, well thought out data collection and analysis, you're not going to know. Most people don't deliberately make decisions based on race. but it can happen without your knowing it. And when you put data together, sometimes it reveals patterns that leaders never knew were there. I've seen it over and over.
We have 5 minutes left, 2 more questions. So I'm gonna do the one right now, and then the second question is answered in our summary slide, I think already. So the last kind of question before I move to that summary slide is, and it kind of, again, speaking to this history idea and what you mentioned in number 8 on the screen about current slide. So you talked a little bit about, the power of social media, but how do we overcome sort of the unsubstantiated opinions that people have? So when they talk about the facts are, or the history is, and somebody would swear on a stack of Bibles that it's this because that's what they were told, and that isn't the fact or history because social media pushed them with false information. What do you do when you're working with somebody who believes an alternative set of facts?
Two thoughts. One is that, and this is not a perfect solution in our time, because unfortunately we're living in a time where people don't admit, too many people don't even respect facts. So, but what I still believe in is the value of data to refute or to counter opinion or viewpoints that are unsubstantiated, that are held by people, to really bring data to bear that says, here's what we thought, here's what's actually happening. And the second thing is that I think trust is very important. We have to develop sources for information that we trust, where we think we can go to get a true objective viewpoint on things. And we need to encourage that with everybody that's in our sphere of influence, because some of the stuff that's going on right now is just crazy. I mean, and someone has said perception is reality, and there's a lot of truth to that. But we counter false perceptions, I think, with data and facts, and also with viewpoints from people that we trust, that help us to see that maybe the way we're looking at this is skewed, unbalanced, or just outright incorrect.
Another suggestion I have in this space is there's Adam Grant's new book. He's a professor and researcher called Think Again, has laid out some very specific and compelling examples of ways in which you have conversations. There's some data with physicians that have made movement in communities that are anti-vaccination communities because they don't believe in the science. There's some great examples in the book of an African-American musician who spent time working with Ku Klux Klan leaders to help change their opinions. And a lot of this is about his view and approach. So if you're really stuck in this area and you want to lean in, this would go under that. Educate yourself, do something different, lean into it. So I just personally read that a couple weeks ago and loved the book. So that's my kind of hot off the presses read, Adam Grant's Think Again. We have 2 minutes left, and so I do want to honor our time. So let me just quickly go to our last slide in summary of sort of the programmatic things that you can do. And I think we've covered these at a high level. So I just want to leave this out here in case somebody wants to review to it later. But, obtain senior leaders' commitment and personal involvement. We've talked about that. Then cascade this down to do education for team members within your organization. We do believe, to the last question, what do you do to start this movement, was the other question that was on our chat, is to create a strategy plan and DE&I focus in your organization. So create a council, a committee, a group of people, so educate, get senior level buy-in, and then create a plan that can look at these in-groups, out-groups that we talked about. And then fourth, use learning momentum to drive continuous improvement. So talk about it, keep it involved in the way in which you do all your other business processes, but do it all from the mindset of, creating safety in the organization, being kind to yourself. If you're part of the majority group or the minority group and you don't know how to have conversations, you might step over yourself once in a while. Just keep trying and have open conversation and dialogue, but create a plan. And as Taylor just rightfully said, we need to measure it as well. We are out of time. We do have a slide about the model that is in Dr. Cox's book. You can see it's called Creating the Multicultural Organization. We don't have time to cover this today, but I would ask you to take a look at that. Feel free to buy that book as well. If you are interested in a copy of the Positive Race Relations book, Lauren is going to put in the chat now. You can either purchase it at Westbow Press, which is where it was produced. I think there's the nonprofit that Taylor was talking about earlier gets a little bit more money from it buying it that way. But if you're Amazon click of a button kind of person, feel free to buy it from there. And you can get a link to both of those. Encourage you to buy. It's a really easy application workbook with a lot of great insights, but it's easy to digest. So I think it's wonderful. And then last, to close up, our next webinar, I'm doing two different things. One is partnering with the training industry to do a talk on this with their modern leadership series. There's a no-cost leadership program. I think it's from 11 to 2 or 3 on June 9th, and I'll be the speaker at noon that day, talking about the 6 elements of a leadership mindset. And then our next Dion webinar series, we're gonna delve into with another partner on the rapid changing area of labor relations. If some of you are following that, what's going on in the labor space is pretty crazy with our political change, and wanted to update you on that as part of another important element of creating great workplaces. So we are 1 minute over today. So Dr. Cox, thank you so much for your time and attention. Any last quick comments or anything else you'd like to say before we close up?
Just thank you to everyone. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to share with you today. And thank you, Steve.
Thank you, everyone. And if you have any other comments, questions, want to keep a dialogue on this conversation, we're passionate about it, would love to do that. Thanks. Have a good day.